January 1st, 1863. Late morning, the White House. Abraham Lincoln sits at his desk with a single sheet of paper in front of him, already copied in clean official handwriting, waiting for the one thing that makes it operative: his name. And his right hand won't stop trembling. Not from doubt, from fatigue. New Year's Day in Washington is a public ritual. Diplomats, senators, officers, ordinary citizens. Hundreds of people file through a reception line to shake the president's hand. Lincoln has been standing for hours, gripping palm after palm until his forearm is numb and his fingers cramp. Now he finally sits down. The pen tip wobbles. Lincoln notices instantly what that wobble will become if it's captured in ink, a signature that looks weak and a document that will be attacked as weak. He pauses and says it out loud to the men in the room, because he understands the kind of war he's fighting isn't only on battlefields. If his name comes out shaky, enemies will claim hesitation. So he waits until he can control the pen. Then he signs, and when the ink dries, the Emancipation Proclamation becomes a standing order of the United States government. Most Americans treat that as the whole story. Signature, freedom, end. But the proclamation isn't written like a moral speech. It's written like an operational directive. It names jurisdictions. It lists exceptions. It gives the Army and Navy instructions they can apply the moment a person reaches Union lines. So the real question isn't, was it inspiring? The real question is what changed on January 1st, inside federal paperwork, inside Union camps, and inside the chain of command, because of those clauses. Start with the document's legal foundation. Lincoln doesn't present it as Congress abolishing slavery. He issues it, by virtue of the power, as Commander-in-Chief and as a fit and necessary war measure to suppress the rebellion. That is the document's support beam. It's not trying to be permanent law. It's trying to be enforceable policy during a war. Then the proclamation makes its central move. It declares that all persons held as slaves within designated rebellious areas are and henceforward shall be free. Lincoln does not apply this declaration to the entire United States. He applies it to places described as in rebellion, and he specifies those places. He names the states. Then he carves out exceptions with a precision that reads like a map legend. Areas already under Union control inside Confederate states are exempted, down to specific counties and parishes. That detail is not decorative. It is what makes the document function as a military measure, rather than a sweeping national statute. If you were enslaved in a loyal border slave state on January 1st, this paper did not change your legal status that day. If you were enslaved in a Confederate region explicitly exempted because it was already occupied or treated separately, the proclamation, by its own text, left you outside its declared zone. Now comes the clause that turns a declaration into a usable field policy. The proclamation orders that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority, will recognize and maintain the freedom of those persons declared free. That sentence is the hinge, because it pushes emancipation down into the war machine. It tells officers what their government is now committed to doing wherever Union force can reach. It also standardizes what had been inconsistent for more than a year. Before this, enslaved people fleeing into Union lines created constant improvisation. Some commanders treated them as contraband. Some returned them. Some used them as labor. Some wrote their own policies. The federal government had not yet issued one single order that told the Army and Navy what freedom was supposed to mean in practice across the theater. January 1st changes that, not by instantly rewriting life everywhere, by rewriting instructions everywhere the Union Army and Navy operate. Now picture what that looks like on the ground. A Union camp in the Mississippi River Corridor, early 1863. A family reaches the outer line of pickets. They arrive with nothing but what they can carry. The officer on duty has to decide what happens next: food, shelter, labor arrangements, protection from raiders, documentation, transport. Before January 1st, this kind of moment depended heavily on the personality of the commander and the local politics around him. After January 1st, Lincoln has put a federal order behind that moment in the rebel-designated areas. The military is to recognize and maintain freedom rather than suppress efforts toward it. That transforms escape into a process the Union now has to manage as policy, not tolerate as a nuisance. It creates administrative consequences immediately. Camps become intake points. Commanders become de facto governors. The Union has to feed, house, and protect people it has now implicitly encouraged to move. And that leads directly to the next clause, one line that changes the war's manpower. Lincoln adds that black men will be received into the armed service of the United States, not as a vague aspiration, as a declared policy. That sentence does two things at once. It opens recruitment and formalizes enlistment. It also signals that the Union will fight this war with people the Confederacy has tried to keep powerless. Once black enlistment becomes federal policy, it forces downstream decisions: pay, training, deployment, command structure, prisoner of war treatment, retaliation risk, and morale inside white regiments that were never told they would serve alongside black troops. Those consequences start moving the moment the order exists. Now, widen the lens. The proclamation also changes what foreign governments can plausibly claim they are supporting if they aid the Confederacy. European leaders were watching this conflict through trade, power, and public opinion. A war framed only as Union versus rebellion allows diplomatic flexibility. A war publicly tied to emancipation removes some of that flexibility and increases the political cost of recognition. You don't need a morality speech to understand why that matters. A government deciding whether to deal with the Confederacy has to weigh the optics of dealing with a slaveholding rebellion after the United States has formally attached emancipation to the conflict's outcome. That is a diplomatic constraint created by paperwork. So here's what January 1st, 1863 actually did. Cleanly, mechanically, without mythology. It issued a standing federal order declaring freedom for enslaved people in specified rebellious jurisdictions. It instructed the U.S. Army and Navy to treat that freedom as something to be recognized and maintained wherever federal power could operate. It authorized the reception of black men into U.S. armed service, turning emancipation into manpower and forcing the war's institutions to reorganize around that reality. Those three moves are the operational core. Everything else, every dramatic story, every escape, every battle, every political shockwave, follows from how those clauses interact with a war that is still unfinished. And that unfinished war is the pressure point Lincoln is gambling on. Because this order does not enforce itself behind Confederate lines. It becomes real as Union control expands, which means the proclamation ties its effectiveness to the one variable Lincoln cannot fake: the Union's ability to hold ground. That's why January 1st is not a finish line. It's a commitment that shifts the war's logistics and incentives. To see why Lincoln wrote it this way, you have to rewind. July 22, 1862. The White House, Washington City. It's summer heat that makes uniforms feel like punishment. Inside the cabinet room, Lincoln reads a draft proclamation to his cabinet. Not Congress, not the generals, not the newspapers. A draft, a plan, a document that, if issued at the wrong moment, could look like panic. Secretary of State William Seward sees the problem immediately. If Lincoln announces emancipation after a string of Union setbacks, it reads like desperation, an admission that battlefield failure is being replaced with radical policy. Seward's advice is strategic. Wait until the Union can claim a moment of strength. Make the announcement look like leverage, not flailing. Lincoln accepts the advice, and that creates the countdown structure that leads to January 1st, September 17, 1862. Antietam Creek, Sharpsburg, Maryland. Call it a victory if you want the simple version. Call it a bloodbath if you want the honest one. Nearly 23,000 casualties in a single day. It stops Robert E. Lee's northward momentum and gives Lincoln the political footing Seward told him he needed. 5 days later, September 22, 1862, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It is a notice with a deadline. It states that if rebellious areas do not return to the Union by January 1st, their enslaved people will be, then, thenceforward, and forever free. That is not merely a warning to the Confederacy, it's a credibility trap for the Union government. Once the president announces a specific date, he can't quietly retreat without looking weak to allies, enemies, enslaved people listening for any sign of federal intent, and foreign governments calculating whether the United States can sustain its own declared policy. So the 100 days between September 22nd and January 1st become a pressure corridor. Newspapers argue. Governors posture. Border state politicians threaten. Abolitionists insist the deadline must be honored. Military commanders begin anticipating what the order will mean in practice. Enslaved people hear that the federal government has put a date in writing. Then the date arrives, January 1st, 1863. Lincoln signs the final proclamation after hours of handshakes with a sore arm and a deliberate signature. From that moment forward, the war stops treating emancipation as an unofficial byproduct and begins treating it as an explicit federal objective inside the named rebel jurisdictions. Union advances don't only restore federal authority. They create a new administrative condition behind the lines, freedom to be recognized and maintained, plus a recruitment policy that begins turning the formerly enslaved into Union soldiers. That is what the document does in practice. It changes what Union occupation means, and it changes what the Union Army is expected to do with the human reality of the South as it moves. It also forces the Confederacy to confront a new kind of internal threat: flight, labor disruption, and the possibility that people who escape can return in uniform. Those are consequences created by a signed directive, not by a speech, not by a hope, by a chain of command instruction that makes emancipation part of the war's operating system. January 2, 1863, War Department, Washington City. The paper Lincoln signed is no longer sitting in a room full of witnesses. Now it has to move. Clerks copy the text into official packets. Printers set type. Runners carry bundles down corridors. The Union does not fight with intention alone. It fights with distribution. A presidential order that stays in Washington is a rumor with a signature, so the War Department republishes it as a military directive, something commanders can't pretend they never saw. An order number, a date, a line in the chain of command record. Because from this point forward, the proclamation creates situations officers can't dodge. If a slaveholder shows up behind Union lines claiming property, somebody has to decide whether the Army enforces that claim or rejects it. If a family arrives at a picket line asking if the president's words apply here, somebody has to answer with something stronger than personal opinion. If Confederate raiders ride toward a camp to seize fugitives back, somebody has to decide whether that camp is protected as a military responsibility or treated as a temporary inconvenience. Recognize and maintain sounds simple until it turns into daily operations. Every new arrival means rations. Every new arrival means shelter. Every new arrival means disease risk, security risk, and internal discipline problems. A provost marshal doesn't interpret ideals. He interprets orders. A quartermaster doesn't measure morality. He measures supplies. So the Army starts doing what large institutions do when a policy creates new human traffic. It builds procedures, names recorded, work details organized, guard posts adjusted, transport arranged, paperwork created so the flow can be managed rather than denied. That's the buried reality inside Lincoln's signature. He didn't just declare something, he assigned it to departments that now have to execute it. And the moment execution begins, it creates friction inside the Union itself. Border state politicians read the proclamation and ask what comes next. Conservative editors call it dangerous. Some officers see it as a mission creep they never signed up for. Others see it as overdue. The War Department hears all of it and keeps doing the same thing anyway, converting policy into routine. By early 1863, that routine has a visible shape in the South. It's not a celebration. It's a camp. A Union camp in occupied territory isn't only a military site now. It becomes a decision point. A place where freedom is processed into reality in the least romantic way possible, by being managed. A family arrives. A clerk writes a line. A guard assigns a space. A surgeon evaluates sickness. A commander decides whether to keep them close, move them, or recruit from them. Those choices weren't standardized in 1861. They become harder to ignore in 1863. And that's not because Lincoln wrote better sentences. It's because he changed what the Army is officially responsible for. A step back explains why it had to be written like this. May 1862. A Union general tries to run ahead of Washington with a sweeping military emancipation order. Lincoln revokes it. The message is direct. Commanders do not get to invent national emancipation policy at will because one uncontrolled proclamation can shatter the political balance keeping the Union together. That earlier clash is why the January 1st proclamation looks like a weapon rather than a blanket. It is written to be deployable, controllable, legally defensible under war powers. That is why it names rebellious jurisdictions. That is why it lists exceptions down to counties and parishes. The text is designed so Lincoln can say, this is not an abstract moral decree. This is an action taken to weaken an act of rebellion. That structure creates a strange effect after January 1st. Emancipation becomes a moving boundary. Freedom spreads with military control. The order follows the flag, which means one of the first things the proclamation does is create new incentives. For enslaved people, it signals that Union lines are no longer just a gamble. They are tied to declared federal intent. For Confederate authorities, it signals that holding people in place is no longer just a social system. It's now a military vulnerability. For Union commanders, it signals that occupation isn't only about holding towns. It includes managing the human consequences of the system those towns were built on. That's why the next clause matters so much. Black enlistment. Once the proclamation states that black men will be received into U.S. armed service, emancipation stops being only a labor disruption. It becomes a manpower conversion. That one sentence turns a fleeing population into a recruitment pool, and the Union government immediately starts building the pipeline to handle it. Recruiting stations begin receiving directives. State governments begin raising units. Officers who never imagined they would command black soldiers begin receiving assignments that make it unavoidable. Then the War Department does what it always does when a policy becomes too large for ad hoc handling. It standardizes it. A bureau, a system for organizing black regiments, a way to process enlistment at scale. The result isn't a symbolic handful of men. By the end of the war, roughly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors will have served the Union cause. That scale matters because it forces procedural consequences downstream. Pay systems have to be defined, training has to be built, equipment has to be issued. Promotion ceilings become arguments. Prisoner of war policy becomes a crisis point. The Confederacy cannot treat black soldiers the same way it treats white soldiers without admitting what those uniforms mean. So it reaches for retaliation logic instead. Threats, punishments, a refusal to grant equal status. Those decisions then force the Union to respond with its own procedures: how to protect captives, how to retaliate, how to hold the line on prisoner exchange. This is the war evolving through paperwork. A proclamation becomes orders. Orders become administration. Administration becomes consequences. And those consequences are visible overseas too. Diplomacy runs on plausible deniability and public justification. In 1862, foreign leaders can still treat the Civil War like an internal political rupture and keep their options open. Once emancipation becomes public federal policy, open support for the Confederacy becomes more expensive to defend in parliaments, newspapers, and city streets. That doesn't require any government to become saintly. It only requires governments to fear backlash. A diplomatic cable doesn't need to say this is immoral. It only needs to say, this will cost us. That is the kind of constraint Lincoln's order creates without ever using emotional language. It shifts the war's external framing by changing what the United States government has formally attached to victory, and then the internal logic tightens again. Because once you issue emancipation under war powers, a new legal problem appears on the horizon. War powers are strongest during war. When war ends, emergency authority shrinks. That means the proclamation's legal foundation is tied to the continuation of the rebellion and the continuation of federal war authority. Lincoln understands this, so the proclamation should be understood as a bridge, not to a speech, to permanence. Because if freedom is secured only by a wartime directive, then the end of war creates a question no commander can answer at a picket line. Does the policy survive peace? If the Union wants a permanent answer, it eventually needs a permanent instrument. That is why the proclamation matters even beyond its immediate enforcement zone. It changes the operating system of the war in a way that pushes the Union toward the next mechanical step, making abolition something that can't be reversed by the end of hostilities. Lincoln's January 1st signature does not end slavery everywhere that morning. It does something more precise in terms of state capacity. It makes emancipation an executive commitment. It makes the military responsible for maintaining that commitment where it can. It opens a recruitment channel that starts reorganizing the Union's manpower and the Confederacy's internal stability. Then it forces governments, Union, Confederate, foreign, to respond procedurally. In camps, in recruiting stations, in War Department files, in diplomatic decisions. That is what changed on January 1st, 1863. Not the presence of an idea, the presence of an order. And once an order enters a bureaucracy during a war, it doesn't stay theoretical. It creates routines. It creates conflict. It creates actions people can be punished for refusing to carry out. So if you want the cleanest answer to the title, what the Emancipation Proclamation actually did on January 1st, 1863, it's this. It converted emancipation from contested wartime improvisation into formal federal directive, pushed that directive into the Army and Navy as executable instruction, and authorized black enlistment as policy, changing the procedures that governed Union occupation and the incentives that governed Confederate control. Nothing mystical. No instant transformation everywhere, just a signature that forces the war to move differently from that day forward.